An exciting story of redemption, love, passion, and new beginnings. She was invisible to the world, virginal, innocent, and considered plain. But the most coveted millionaire in town couldn't take his eyes off her. Watch this story until the end. You'll be surprised by what unfolds. If you enjoy love stories and romance, subscribe to this channel and leave your comment. We post videos like this every day. Continuing. The steam rising from the kettle was the same as every day, but on that September morning it carried something different in the air. Lydia Rodriguez ran her hand across the wooden surface of the counter at Aurora Tea House, feeling every scratch, every mark that the years had left. 32 years of life, 6 spent caring for this small refuge she had inherited from Aunt Hope, and she still felt like a stranger in her own world. The town of Stone Peak was waking slowly in the early spring. Through the windows of the tea house she observed the still timid movement on Flower Street, the main artery of the historic downtown. Some ladies on their way to 6 o'clock mass, the occasional City Hall employee carrying yellowed folders, and tourists who were beginning to discover the charms of the small coastal town 100 miles from Jacksonville. Lydia didn't consider herself part of this scene. She was more like a shadow that served tea and cookies, who heard other people's conversations without ever participating in them, who knew the secrets of the entire town, but kept her own buried so deep that sometimes she forgot they existed. Her brown hair was tied in the usual bun, neither too tight nor too loose, just enough not to draw attention. Her clothes were discreet, shades of beige and brown that made her almost disappear against the wooden walls of the century-old house. Aurora. Tea House wasn't just a business, it was a piece of Stone Peak's history. Built in 1880 by a Portuguese merchant who had fallen in love with a freed slave named Aurora, the house had traversed generations, keeping its colonial architecture intact. The thick stone and lime walls, the sash windows with colored glass, the high ceiling that allowed air to circulate even on the hottest days of the Florida summer. Aunt Hope always said that the house chose its residents, not the other way around. And when Lydia arrived there at 26, fleeing from a life she could no longer bear in Jacksonville, the house received her as if it had been waiting for her for years. It was Hope who taught her the secrets of teas, the exact proportions, infusion times, the art of reading in clients' faces which drink would bring comfort to their restless souls. Now, 6 years after her aunt's death, Lydia maintained the tradition with the same religious dedication. She woke at 5 in the morning, prepared the day's blends, organized the porcelain cups that were family heirlooms, cut generous slices of the cornbread she made twice a week. At 6 o'clock sharp, she opened the doors for the first customers. Mrs. Carmen was the first to arrive, as always. Widowed for 15 years, she found in Aurora Tea House what her empty home no longer offered, a purpose to get out of bed every morning. She ordered chamomile tea with honey, the same as always, and settled at the corner table near the window that looked out at the abandoned mansion across the street. "Lydia, dear, did you see the movement out front yesterday?" Mrs. Carmen spoke, while stirring her tea with the silver teaspoon that Lydia always set aside especially for her. A black car arrived, one of those expensive ones, and a very elegant man got out. They say he's the new owner of the Thompson mansion. Lydia nodded, silently, as she always did when customers shared the town's news. The Thompson mansion had been abandoned for more than 20 years, since the family moved to New York and never returned. It was an imposing 3-story building with architecture that blended Portuguese and French influences. The windows were boarded up, the garden had become a jungle of tall weeds, and the yellow paint on the walls was peeling like skin dried by the sun. "Just imagine what plans this man must have for that mansion," continued Mrs. Carmen, talking more to herself than expecting an answer. "I hope it's something that will improve business around here. Tourism has been a bit slow, don't you think?" Lydia served a slice of still-warm cornbread and returned behind the counter. She didn't like to speculate about other people's lives, but she admitted a curiosity about the future of that building that had framed her window for so many years. There was something melancholic about those peeling walls, the blind windows, the wild garden. It was like looking at a mirror of what she herself might become if she hadn't found purpose in Aurora Tea House. The bell at the door rang again, and Professor Henry entered with his worn leather briefcase and the same gentle smile as always. Retired from the municipal school, he had become one of the most loyal customers of the house, appearing every morning for black tea with brown sugar and a long conversation about literature with Lydia. "Good morning, my dear Lydia. Today's tea has a special aroma," he said, inhaling deeply as he settled at his usual table, near the bookshelf that Aunt Hope had installed for customers. "It's the new blend I experimented with. Black tea with hints of cinnamon and cardamom," replied Lydia, allowing herself a small smile. Professor Henry was one of the few people with whom she felt comfortable talking. "Ah, the Oriental spices always bring mystery to everyday life. Speaking of mystery, did you hear that a buyer finally appeared for the Thompson mansion?" The question made Lydia raise her eyes from the cup she was preparing. Mrs. Carman mentioned something about a man in a black car. "August Bennett, that's his name." Professor Henry lowered his voice like someone sharing a secret. "I researched him on the library's internet. Construction business entrepreneur. Very successful. Works mainly in Jacksonville and Miami. Interestingly, he was born here in Stone Peak but left while still young." Lydia felt a pang of curiosity that she preferred to ignore. And what does he plan to do with the mansion? That's still a mystery, but a man like him wouldn't invest in a property like that without having grand plans. The rest of the morning passed in the usual routine. Customers coming and going, conversations about the weather, about town news, about weekend plans. Lydia listened to everything with the attention of someone who collects other people's stories to fill the emptiness of her own, but always maintaining the necessary distance to avoid getting too involved. It was around 2 in the afternoon, when the tea house traffic had diminished, and she was taking advantage of the lull to organize the tea stock, that she heard a noise from outside. It wasn't common to have much noise at that time, especially coming from the direction of the abandoned mansion. Curious, she approached the window and slightly moved aside the white linen curtain. Across the street, gates that hadn't opened in decades were creaking heavily. A man in a dark suit was standing in what had once been the front garden, looking at the facade of the mansion with his hands on his hips, in a posture that demonstrated ownership and determination. Even at a distance, Lydia could tell that this was someone accustomed to command, to the authority that comes not only from money, but from the certainty that the world organizes itself according to his will. The man had graying hair, appeared to be in his 50s, and there was something in the way he moved that suggested a lifetime built on quick decisions and concrete results. He walked through the abandoned garden, kicking dry branches, examining the structure of the house with technical eyes, making notes in a small notebook he took from the inside pocket of his jacket. Lydia couldn't look away. It had been years since that garden had received a human presence, and now there was a man there, bringing movement to a scene that she had become accustomed to seeing as a static painting. He seemed out of place in that wild environment, with his impeccable suit and polished leather shoes, but at the same time, there was determination in every step he took. It was when he turned toward Aurora Tea House that their gazes met. The curtain was still slightly pulled back, and Lydia knew he could see her perfectly framed against the illuminated window. For a moment that seemed to last an eternity, they looked at each other across the street, across the years of abandonment that separated the two properties, across completely different worlds. His eyes were dark, intense, accustomed to deciphering complex situations and finding solutions. Hers were brown and frightened, like those of a wild animal caught in a moment of vulnerability. Lydia felt her face heat up and immediately released the curtain, taking a step back, as if she had been caught doing something forbidden. Her heart raced in a way she couldn't understand. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something more disturbing, more intimate. It was as if those eyes had seen through the window not only her face but also all the secrets she guarded so carefully. She spent the rest of the afternoon trying not to think about the meeting of gazes, but every time she approached the window, she felt a mixture of expectation and terror that he might still be there. When she finally allowed herself to look again, the garden was empty, and the gates were closed. Night came with the salt breeze that rose from the sea, bringing the aroma of sea air that always calmed Lydia. After closing the tea house, she went up to the small apartment on the second floor, where she had lived alone since arriving in Stone Peak. It was a simple but cozy space, with furniture inherited from Aunt Hope and walls full of books she had collected since adolescence. She prepared herself a cup of lemon balm tea and settled in the armchair near the bedroom window, which offered a privileged view of the Thompson mansion. Now in the dark, the building seemed even more mysterious, more laden with untold stories. The sealed windows looked like the closed eyes of a sleeping giant, waiting for the moment to awaken. Lydia opened the book she was reading, a collection of short stories by Alice Munro, but the words danced on the page without making sense. Her mind constantly returned to that afternoon moment, to the impact of those eyes that saw her when she wasn't prepared to be seen. She had spent years building an invisible existence, a life where she could care for others without needing to expose herself, where she could offer comfort without revealing her own needs. And now, with a simple look, a stranger had disturbed the carefully constructed balance of her existence. The next morning, Lydia woke earlier than usual. Sleep had been restless, populated by confused dreams where she ran through abandoned gardens, and there was always someone watching her from a distance. She went down to the tea house before 5 in the morning, seeking in the familiar ritual of tea preparation, the tranquility that the night had not offered. She was organizing the cups when she heard the bell at the door ring. It was very early for any regular customer, and she turned expecting to perhaps see Mrs. Carman with some morning urgency. Instead, she found herself face to face with the man from the mansion. August Bennett was standing at the entrance of Aurora tea house, slightly bent to pass through the low door, filling the small space with a presence that seemed too large for the cozy dimensions of the environment. He had exchanged the suit for what he probably considered casual clothes: dark chinos, a white linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up, leather shoes that still seemed too expensive to step on the rustic wooden floor of the tea house. "Good morning," he said, and his voice was deep, polite, with an accent that mixed his Floridian origin with years lived in large urban centers. "I'm looking for a place to have breakfast. I hope it's not too early." Lydia was paralyzed for a few seconds, holding a porcelain cup with both hands as if it were a shield. He was even more imposing up close, with marked features that suggested an intense life, eyes that seemed accustomed to getting what they wanted. There was a natural elegance in his movements, even when he was clearly out of his usual environment. "No, it's not early," she finally managed to respond, her voice coming out lower than she intended. "You can sit wherever you prefer." He chose the table near the window, the same one that offered a view of the mansion, and Lydia wondered if the choice was deliberate. As he settled in, she fought against the impulse to run upstairs and lock herself in her room. Instead, she took a deep breath and approached the table with the small pad where she noted orders. "What would you like to drink?" she asked, keeping her eyes fixed on the paper. "What do you recommend?" The question forced her to raise her gaze, and again she found herself captured by those dark eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "It depends on what you're looking for. Something energizing to start the day, or something milder to relax?" "Surprise me," he said, and there was an almost imperceptible smile at the corner of his mouth. "I have the impression that you know well what people need." Lydia returned behind the counter with her face flaming. There was something in the way he spoke, a tone that suggested intimacy even between strangers, that left her completely disoriented. She decided to prepare a black tea with spices, strong enough to wake anyone, but with touches of cinnamon and cardamom that brought comfort. While the water heated, she observed him discreetly. He was looking out the window toward the mansion, but occasionally his eyes turned to her, as if he were trying to decipher some enigma. There was something calculated about his presence there, as if this visit wasn't casual. "Are you the owner?" he asked when she brought the tea accompanied by a slice of cornbread. "I am," she responded, without moving away from the table more than necessary. "Beautiful place. How old is the house?" 143 years. It was built by a Portuguese merchant named Edward Mills, who fell in love with a freed slave named Aurora. The words came out automatically, repeating the story she told to tourists. Interested in local architecture, Aurora, like the name of the tea house. He tasted the tea and nodded in approval. And you? Were you born here in Stone Peak? The personal question caught her off guard. No, I came from Jacksonville a few years ago. Ah, we're from the same city then. I was also born here but spent most of my life elsewhere. Lydia nodded, pretending not to know who he was, although Professor Henry had shared the details the previous morning. There was something disturbing in the way he conducted the conversation, as if he were mapping territories before deciding on his occupation strategy. The mansion across the street, he continued, pointing toward the window, belonged to my family. My grandfather bought it from the Thompsons in the 60s. Now it's back in my hands. Do you plan to live here? She asked, surprised by her own curiosity. I have other plans. He took another sip of tea, savoring not only the drink but also the moment. Something that might interest the entire town. There was something ominous in the way he said this, but before Lydia could ask anything else, the bell at the door rang and Mrs. Carmen entered, stopping abruptly upon seeing the elegant man at the window table. Good morning, Lydia, said the lady, her eyes quickly passing between the tea house owner and the unknown customer. Good morning, Mrs. Carmen. The usual tea. Please, dear. Lydia returned behind the counter, relieved to have an excuse to move away from the table, where August Bennett continued to observe her with that disturbing intensity. While preparing the chamomile with honey, she could hear the polite conversation between him and Mrs. Carmen, she obviously curious about who this man was, and him responding with professional charm but without revealing many details. When he finished his tea and politely said goodbye, Lydia felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. The atmosphere of the tea house returned to normal, with Mrs. Carmen occupying her usual table and making speculations in a low voice about the mysterious man who had just left. But something had irreversibly changed. Aurora Tea House, which for years had been her safe refuge, now carried the memory of that disturbing presence. The smell of his cologne still lingered in the air, mixed with the aroma of spices. The cup he had used seemed different from the others, as if it had absorbed something of his personality. And Lydia knew, with a certainty that frightened her, that he would return. Not just because he was too polite not to return after being well served, but because she had seen in his eyes the same restless curiosity that she herself was feeling. Two people from completely different worlds had recognized each other at some deep and inexplicable level, and this was at the same time the most exciting and most terrifying thing that had ever happened in the carefully controlled life of Lydia Rodriguez. The rest of the day passed in a fog of expectation and anxiety. Each time the doorbell rang, her heart raced. Each time it wasn't him, a pang of disappointment pierced her. At the end of the day, when she closed the doors and went up to her apartment, Lydia realized that she had spent 12 hours thinking about a man she had met for less than an hour, and this terrified her as much as it excited her. From the bedroom window, she could see lights on in the Thompson mansion for the first time in decades. August Bennett was there, probably planning the other plans he had mentioned in the morning. Plans that could change not only the landscape of the street, but the entire peaceful life she had built in Stone Peak. Lydia slept that night with the sensation of being on the eve of a storm. Something was coming, something big and inevitable, and she didn't know if she should prepare to resist or surrender to the force of the approaching winds. August Bennett returned the next day, and the next, and the day after that. Always at the same time, between 9 and 10 in the morning, when the movement at Aurora Tea House was still calm, and Lydia had time for longer conversations. He ordered different teas each day, as if he were exploring a menu he had never tried before, but always accompanied by the same generous slice of cornbread that she cut with slightly trembling hands. On the third visit, he brought a book. Alice Munro, he said, placing the worn copy of Lives of Girls and Women on the wooden table. I saw you reading last night, through the window of your apartment. Lydia felt her face heat up. The idea that he had observed her in her intimacy, even at a distance, brought a mixture of embarrassment and something she couldn't name. I didn't know you paid attention to neighbors' windows. I usually don't. He opened the book on a page marked with a yellowed paper. But there's something about you that sparks curiosity. It was too direct a statement, too intimate for the formal relationship they were trying to maintain. Lydia pretended to be busy organizing the clean cups, but her ears were attentive to every word he said. "What passage did you mark?" she asked, yielding to curiosity despite herself. "I am free. I know there are other ways to be free, but this is how I am free." He read slowly as if savoring each word. "It made me think of you." "Why?" "Because of the way you move in this space, as if you had found a very particular way to exist in the world." Lydia stopped what she was doing. No one had ever spoken about her that way, as if her existence had purpose, as if her choices were deliberate and not just the result of fear or inadequacy. "I don't know if freedom is the right word." "Then what would it be?" She thought for a moment, seeking honesty, in a conversation that had already exceeded all the limits of what she considered safe. "Protection. I built this place as a kind of fortress." "Against what?" The question hung in the air between them. Lydia served his tea, an Earl Grey with bergamot that he had requested, and allowed herself to sit in the chair across from him. It was the first time she had sat with a customer, the first time she had transformed service into a conversation between equals. "Against disappointment, I think," she finally answered. "Against the feeling of not being enough for the world." "Out there?" August studied her with those dark eyes that seemed to see through carefully constructed defenses. "And did it work?" "Until now." "And now?" The question carried implications that she wasn't ready to face. Instead of answering, she changed the subject to safer territory. "And you? What brought you back to Stone Peak after so many years?" It was his turn to hesitate. August drank the tea slowly as if deciding how much of the truth he could share. "Business initially, but there's something more." "Something like what?" "Have you ever had the feeling that you spent your whole life building the wrong person?" The question hit her like a punch to the stomach. It was exactly the feeling that had brought her to Stone Peak, that had made her abandon a life in Jacksonville. That had never quite fit right. "Yes." "At 52, I discovered that everything I built, the company, the reputation, the relationships, was based on a version of myself that I no longer recognize." There was a vulnerability in his voice that contrasted with the confidence he demonstrated in all other aspects. Lydia found herself wanting to console him, wanting to offer the same welcome that she offered to clients who arrived with heavy hearts. But there was something dangerous in the emotional proximity that was establishing itself between them. "And you came back here looking for what?" "Perhaps the person I was before I started pretending to be who I thought I should be." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Professor Henry, who politely greeted August before settling at his usual table. Lydia quickly stood up, relieved to have an excuse to move away from the intensity of that dialogue, but at the same time feeling a pang of frustration at the interruption. August finished his tea in silence, left the book on the table, and said goodbye with a discreet nod. But before leaving, he leaned slightly over the counter and said, low enough that only she could hear, "Thank you for the conversation. It's been a long time since I talked about important things." After he left, Lydia stood looking at the forgotten book on the table. Professor Henry, always observant, commented casually, "Interesting man, that August Bennett. It's not common to see successful businessmen reading Alice Munro." "No, it isn't," she agreed, still processing the conversation they had had. "I heard he hired an architecture firm from Jacksonville to make a project for the mansion. Something big, from what they've been saying at City Hall." The information brought Lydia back to reality. For a few moments she had forgotten that August wasn't just an interesting man who liked literature and deep conversations. He was a businessman, with concrete plans for a property that was a few meters from her house, plans that could affect the entire dynamics of Stone Peak's historic downtown. "What kind of project?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "It's not certain yet, but from the movement it must be something that will shake up the whole region." The rest of the day passed in a mixture of expectation and apprehension. Lydia found herself constantly returning to the book left on the table, reading and rereading the passage he had marked. There was something prophetic in those words of Alice Munro, as if the writer had anticipated exactly the moment in which she found herself, on the threshold between the security of confinement and the terrifying possibility of openness. The next morning, August arrived earlier than usual. The house was still closed to the public when he knocked on the glass door, and Lydia, who was finishing the morning preparations, hesitated before letting him in. "I forgot the book yesterday," he said, but there was something in his look that suggested the excuse was only partially true. "It's there on the table," she indicated, keeping the door ajar as if she wasn't sure if she should invite him in. He picked up the book but made no mention of leaving. "May I have some tea? I promise not to disturb your preparations." Lydia opened the door completely, and he entered, bringing with him the smell of expensive soap and something more subtle that she was beginning to associate specifically with him. It was the smell of self-assured masculinity, of financial success, of the outside world she had abandoned years ago. "What tea would you like today?" she asked, returning behind the counter in an attempt to maintain some formality between them. "What do you drink when you're alone?" The question caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" "At night, when you close the house and go up to your apartment, what tea do you prepare for yourself?" It was too intimate a question, presupposing a level of observation that left her vulnerable. "Chamomile with honey. Nothing very special." "Then serve me that." Lydia prepared 2 cups of the infusion, an unconscious decision that she only realized when she was carrying both to the table. August smiled when she sat in the chair across from him, as if he knew that she had crossed some invisible barrier. "Thank you for letting me in before opening hours," he said. "I don't usually do that." "I imagine not." They drank in silence for a few moments, a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but laden with unexplored possibilities. Outside, Stone Peak was beginning to wake up, the distant sound of a car passing, the singing of blue jays in the wild garden of the mansion, the aroma of fresh bread coming from the bakery 2 blocks away. "May I ask a personal question?" said August, breaking the silence. Lydia nodded, although she wasn't sure if she was prepared for any question he might ask. "Why is a woman like you hiding in a small town? A woman like me, intelligent, sensitive, observant, with a depth that most people take years to develop." Lydia felt her face heat up again. No one had ever spoken about her in such complimentary terms, and part of her suspected that he was being too kind, seeing qualities that didn't really exist. "I'm not hiding, I'm living." "Is it the same thing?" "For me, it always has been." August placed the cup on the saucer with a delicate sound of porcelain. "May I tell you something about myself?" She nodded. "I spent the last 20 years of my life building a company that today is worth several $1,000,000. I have apartments in 3 major cities, a car that costs more than most people earn in 5 years, relationships with influential people in practically every important sector of the country." Lydia listened to him in silence, trying to imagine a world so distant from her reality. "And you know what I discovered," he continued, "that success without purpose is just a very expensive form of loneliness. Is that why you came back here?" "I came back because this is the only city where I still remember who I was before. I decided I needed to be someone else to be accepted by the world." The confession had a weight that she didn't expect. There was something devastatingly honest in the way he spoke, as if he were stripping away armor that he had worn for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to live without it. "And are you managing to remember who you were?" "Gradually." He looked her directly in the eyes. "Conversations like this help me." The bell at the door rang, announcing the arrival of Mrs. Carman, punctual as always. Lydia got up quickly, internally thanking the interruption that saved her from having to respond to comments she didn't know how to process. "Good morning, Mrs. Carman. You're early today." "Oh, Lydia, dear, I couldn't sleep properly. It might be the change in weather." The lady looked curiously at August, who had stood up politely. "Good morning, sir." "Good morning, August Bennett." He extended his hand with the natural courtesy of someone accustomed to making good first impressions. "Carmen Wilson, pleasure to meet you." "Likewise. Have you been a long-time customer of the house?" "For more than 5 years, since our dear Lydia opened the doors." "This girl is a treasure of our town." Lydia felt her face heat up at the compliment, but there was something in the way August reacted to Mrs. Carmen's comment that caught her attention, an almost imperceptible smile, as if the lady's assessment confirmed something he had already perceived. "I imagine so," he said, looking briefly at Lydia before saying goodbye. "It was a pleasure, Mrs. Wilson. Lydia, thank you for the tea." After he left, Mrs. Carmen settled at her usual table with a thoughtful expression. "Polite man, that August, and interested in you from what I could tell." "Don't be absurd, Mrs. Carmen, he's just a customer." "Lydia, my child, I'm 82 years old. I've seen interested men enough to recognize the signs." The lady laughed softly. "And from the way you get red when talking about him, the interest isn't just one-sided." Lydia served the chamomile with honey without responding, but she couldn't get Mrs. Carmen's words out of her head. Was it possible that her feelings were so transparent? Was it possible that she, who had spent years considering herself invisible, was the object of interest of a man like August Bennett? The idea was at once exciting and terrifying. The following days established a routine that Lydia began to anticipate with a mixture of expectation and anxiety. August always arrived between 9 and 10 in the morning, ordered different teas, brought books to comment on, asked questions that forced her to think about herself in ways she had avoided for years. It was on a rainy Thursday that he brought the news that would change everything. "I got the City Hall's approval for the project," he said, placing a set of architectural plans on the table. Lydia approached with curiosity and apprehension. The plans showed the Thompson mansion transformed into a luxury inn with 15 suites, a gourmet restaurant, a spa, and a pool that would occupy part of the abandoned garden. "A boutique hotel," explained August, pointing to the different areas, "something that can attract more sophisticated tourism to Stone Peak." It was an impressive project, thought out in the smallest details to preserve the historic architecture while offering all modern comfort. Lydia could imagine how beautiful it would be, how it would bring prosperity to the town, how it would put Stone Peak on the map of Florida tourism. But there was something in the plans that deeply bothered her. "This area here," she said, pointing to a section of the garden that was right on the border with Aurora Tea House. "What would it be?" "Gourmet terrace, an outdoor space for events and special dinners, but it's very close to my house." August looked at the plans as if he were seeing that detail for the first time. "That's true. I hadn't thought of that." But there was something in his expression that suggested otherwise. Lydia had the uncomfortable impression that he knew exactly where the terrace would be located, and that perhaps that proximity wasn't accidental. "Would it be possible to change the project?" she asked. "Everything is possible, but it would be a significant alteration that would delay the schedule and increase costs." The response was polite but firm. August wasn't willing to make changes to the project because of her concerns, and Lydia realized that, despite all the intimacy that had developed between them, she remained just the owner of a small tea house that stood in the way of his grand plans. "When do the works begin?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "In 2 months. Enough time to get the final permits and hire the construction company." Lydia nodded, but a part of her had closed off. The magic of the morning meetings, the conversations about literature, the growing intimacy between them had been contaminated by the reality of the financial interests he represented. "It's a beautiful project," she finally said. "I'm sure it will be a success." August seemed to notice the change in her tone. "Lydia, if there's something that concerns you about the project, we can talk. Maybe find solutions that work for everyone. Don't worry, I'm sure everything will work out." But, even as she said this, she knew that something fundamental had changed between them. The romantic possibility that had begun to flourish now ran into the concrete reality of conflicting interests. He was a businessman with plans to transform the region, and she was just a potential obstacle to those plans. August collected the plans with a thoughtful expression. "May I return tomorrow? I'd like to continue our conversation." "Of course, I'll be here." But after he left, Lydia realized that she wasn't sure if she wanted to continue that conversation. For the first time since he had appeared in her life, she questioned whether it wouldn't be better to maintain the safe distance she had built over the years. That night, she stayed up late, looking out the window at the illuminated mansion. So August was there, probably working on the final details of the project that would transform not only his property, but the entire dynamics of Stone Peak's historic downtown. And for the first time, Lydia wondered if there would be a place for her in this new world he was creating. The next morning, she woke up determined to maintain a professional distance. When August arrived, she served him with the courtesy she reserved for all customers, but without the intimacy that had developed between them in the last few days. He immediately noticed the change. "Did something happen?" he asked after ordering. "The usual tea. Nothing in particular. I just thought that perhaps we were mixing business with other things." "Other things?" Lydia couldn't find words to define what had developed between them. It wasn't quite friendship. It wasn't romance. It was something intermediate and undefined that left her too vulnerable. "You're an important businessman with big plans for the town. I'm just the owner of a small tea house. Maybe it's better if we keep things simple." August studied her for a long moment. "And if I say I don't want to keep things simple?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with implications that Lydia wasn't prepared to face. Outside it began to rain again, and the sound of the drops on the window created a forced intimacy that made it even more difficult to maintain the distance she had decided to impose. "What are you trying to say?" she finally asked. "That maybe I came back to Stone Peak not just to build a hotel, but to find something I didn't even know I was looking for." "And what would that be?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up and approached the window, looking at the rain that was transforming the street into a liquid mirror. "A reason to stay." The answer hit her like lightning. Lydia felt her heart accelerate and at the same time an inner voice screaming for her to be careful, not to believe in beautiful words spoken by a man who belonged to a completely different world from hers. "August. I know it seems crazy. I know we're from different worlds. I know you have every reason to distrust my intentions." He turned to her, and there was a vulnerability in his eyes that she had never seen before. "But I also know that I haven't felt this way about anyone in a very long time." "Felt what?" "The desire to be honest. The desire to stop pretending to be who I thought I should be and simply be." Lydia couldn't respond. Part of her wanted to run upstairs and lock herself in her room until he was gone, and her life returned to the safe normality of before. Another part wanted to cross the space that separated them and discover what would happen if she allowed that moment to develop to its natural consequences. Instead, she was paralyzed, looking at him with a mixture of desire and terror that left her completely immobilized. It was then that the bell at the door rang, and Professor Henry entered, shaking his wet umbrella, unaware that he had interrupted a moment. That could have changed 2 lives forever. Professor Henry entered, shaking his umbrella, oblivious to the tension that hung in the air like electricity before lightning. August and Lydia moved away from each other as if they were magnets with like polarities, she quickly returning behind the counter, he returning to his chair with an expression that mixed frustration and resignation. "What terrible rain," commented the professor, hanging the umbrella on the rack near the entrance. "Good morning, Lydia. Good morning, Mr. Bennett." "Good morning, Professor," replied August, his voice sounding slightly hoarse, as if the words had gotten stuck in his throat. Lydia served the professor's usual black tea with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. The moment that had been interrupted continued to reverberate between her and August, creating a charged atmosphere that seemed visible to any attentive observer. But Professor Henry, always absorbed in his own literary thoughts, didn't seem to notice anything beyond the rain that continued to drum on the windows. "Mr. Bennett," said the professor, settling at his usual table, "I heard you got approval for your project. Congratulations. It will be a beautiful addition to the town's heritage." "Thank you. I hope it really contributes to the development of the region." There was something too formal in August's response, as if he were struggling to maintain his composure after what had happened moments before. Lydia could feel his gaze on her as she pretended to be busy organizing cups that were already perfectly organized. "I imagine the project should boost the local economy quite a bit," continued Professor Henry. "Construction jobs, then hotel operations, increased tourism. It will be an interesting period for our small town." "Yes, that's the goal." August drank the tea that had cooled during the interrupted conversation. "Although any change also brings challenges." Professor Henry nodded thoughtfully. "Changes always bring resistance. There are people who prefer things as they've always been, others who see opportunities. The important thing is to find the balance." The professor's words seemed laden with double meaning, as if he knew more about the situation than he demonstrated. Lydia wondered if the dynamic between her and August was as obvious as Mrs. Carman had suggested. The rain began to diminish, transforming into a fine drizzle that fogged the windows. August finished his tea in silence, clearly lost in thought. When he rose to leave, he addressed the counter where Lydia continued to pretend to be busy. "Thank you for the tea," he said, placing the money on the counter. Then, lowering his voice, just enough that Professor Henry wouldn't hear, he added, "The conversation we were having, it's not over." Lydia briefly raised her eyes, enough to see the determination in his gaze. "Maybe it's better that it's over." "I don't believe that, and neither do you." Before she could respond, he had already left, leaving only the smell of his cologne and a feeling of incompleteness that would accompany her for the rest of the day. Professor Henry, absorbed in reading a book he had taken from his briefcase, didn't seem to notice the exchange of words, but when Lydia approached to refill his cup, he looked up with a knowing expression. Interesting man, that August Bennett. So everyone says. "And you? What do you think of him?" The direct question caught her off guard. Professor Henry had always been discreet, rarely asking personal questions. "I don't have a formed opinion, I barely know him." The professor smiled almost imperceptibly. "Sometimes we know people for decades and remain strangers. Other times a few conversations are enough to recognize a soul. And what does that mean? It means that true connections are rare. When they appear, it's worth paying attention." Lydia didn't respond, but the professor's words echoed in her mind for the rest of the morning. True connections. Was that what was happening with August? Or was she letting herself be carried away by romantic fantasies that had no basis in reality? The tea house traffic increased as the day passed, but Lydia felt disconnected from everything. She served teas, cut slices of cake, answered questions about the history of the house, but her mind kept returning to that interrupted moment, to the words August had said, to the intensity of his gaze when he spoke about finding a reason to stay. It was at the end of the afternoon, when she was closing the house, that she heard knocking at the back door. Her heart immediately accelerated, in a reaction that confirmed her worst fears about how complicated her feelings had become. August was on the other side of the door, without the formal suit this time, wearing a simple shirt and jeans that made him look younger, more accessible. There were drops of rain in his hair, and he seemed to have walked a good distance. "I didn't want to disturb you in front of other customers," he said when she opened the door, "but we need to finish our conversation." Lydia hesitated. The back door led to the small garden, where she cultivated the herbs she used in the teas, a private space that no customer had stepped on before. Letting him enter there would be crossing a line that she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. "I don't know if it's a good idea." "Lydia, please, 5 minutes." There was something in his plea that disarmed her. She opened the door completely, and he entered, immediately stopping to observe the small but well-kept garden. There were beds of mint, chamomile, lemon balm, lemongrass, all organized in precise rows that showed the dedicated care she invested in each plant. "Did you cultivate all this?" "Aunt Hope started it. I just continued." August walked among the beds, delicately touching the leaves, inhaling the aromas that mixed in a symphony of calming fragrances. "It's beautiful. Much more than you imagine. Thank you." They remained silent for a few moments, him exploring the garden, her observing, him with a mixture of pride and nervousness. There was something intimate about having him there, about sharing that space that was her most private refuge. "Lydia," he finally said, stopping near the rose bed that bloomed in an explosion of soft colors, "what do you feel for me?" The direct question left her without an answer. Part of her wanted to be honest, to admit that she had thought of him constantly in the last few days, that she awaited his morning visits with an expectation she hadn't felt in years. Another part warned her about the dangers of exposing herself to a man who could leave at any moment, leaving her with a broken heart and a life that would no longer fit into the safe molds she had built. "I don't know," she finally answered, and it was partially true. "You don't know or you don't want to know, not both." August approached, stopping a few centimeters from her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body, the smell of rain on his clothes. "May I tell you what I feel?" Lydia nodded, although she wasn't sure if she wanted to hear the answer. "I feel as if I had spent years sleeping and suddenly awakened, as if all the colors had become more vivid, all the flavors more intense, as if you had reminded me of something I had forgotten existed." "And what would that be?" "The possibility of being happy." The words hit her like waves, one after another, knocking down the defenses she had built so carefully. Lydia felt her eyes fill with tears, not of sadness but of an emotion so intense that she couldn't name it. "August, I know it's complicated. I know my presence here changes things, that the hotel project can affect your life in ways I didn't foresee. I know you have every reason not to trust me." "It's not about trust," she interrupted, surprising herself with her own honesty. "It's about fear." "Fear of what?" "Of not being enough for you, of discovering that all this is just—" She searched for words. "The fantasy of a bored man who will soon leave and return to his real life." August raised his hand as if he were going to touch her face, but stopped mid-movement. "May I touch you?" The question, so simple and at the same time so laden with meaning, made Lydia's heart race. She nodded, unable to find words. He touched her face with a gentleness that contrasted with the firmness of his hands. His fingers traced the line of her cheek, the contour of her lips, as if he were memorizing every detail. "You are the most real thing that has happened in my life in a very long time," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "And I'm not going away." "How can you be sure?" "Because for the first time in decades I found something that's worth more than all the business I've ever done." Before she could respond, he kissed her. It was a soft kiss, hesitant, as if he, too, were navigating unknown territory. Lydia felt her defenses crumble completely, replaced by an urgency she didn't know. Her hands rose to his shoulders, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had become liquid. When they separated, both were breathing with difficulty. August rested his forehead on hers, closing his eyes, as if trying to engrave that moment in memory. "Lydia." "Don't say anything," she whispered. "Just stay here with me for a few more minutes." They remained like that, embraced in the fragrant garden as the afternoon transformed into night. For the first time in years, Lydia felt completely present, completely alive, completely connected with another person. It was the sound of voices on the street that made them move apart. August looked at his watch and sighed. "I need to go. I have a meeting with the architect in an hour." "About the project?" "Yes, but Lydia, about the terrace that's close to your house. I'm going to ask them to change the project." "You don't need to do that for my sake. It's not just for your sake. It's because I want you to feel comfortable with the changes that are coming. I want you to know that your concerns are important to me." Lydia felt something warm in her chest, a sensation of being valued that she hadn't experienced in a long time. "Thank you. May I see you tomorrow?" "I'll be here." He smiled, that smile that she was beginning to associate with moments of genuine happiness. Then until tomorrow. After he left, Lydia remained alone in the garden, touching her lips that still held the memory of the kiss. Her life had irreversibly changed in those few minutes, and she didn't know whether she should celebrate or prepare for a broken heart. She went up to the apartment with a floating sensation, as if she were walking on clouds. She prepared a lemon balm tea for herself and settled in the armchair near the window, observing the lights on in the Thompson mansion. August was there, probably working, and the idea that he had said he wouldn't leave filled her with cautious hope. But there was a part of her, educated by years of disappointments and loneliness, that whispered warnings about men who promise worlds and then disappear when the novelty loses its charm. The next morning, Lydia woke with a mixture of expectation and anxiety. Each preparation for opening the tea house was done with extra attention, as if August would see not only her, but every detail of the environment where they had shared such intimate moments. He arrived earlier than usual, knocking on the door when she was still finishing organizing the cups. There was something different in his expression, a seriousness that didn't exist the day before. "Good morning," he said, and there was a formality in his voice that immediately put her on alert. "Good morning. Did something happen?" August sat at the usual table but didn't relax as he normally did. "Lydia, I need to tell you something." The tone of his voice made her stomach contract. "What?" "Last night during the meeting with the architect, I discovered something about the project that I didn't know before." Lydia approached, feeling an unpleasant premonition. "What kind of thing?" "The land where Aurora Tea House stands doesn't have the heritage protection documentation we thought. Technically, there's no legal impediment to include it in the hotel project." The words hit her like punches to the stomach. "What does that mean?" "It means that if I wanted to, I could make an offer to buy your property. The value would be much higher than what the house is worth in the current market." Lydia felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. "You want to buy my house?" "No, but I need you to know that this possibility exists, that other people might try to use this information." "What other people?" August hesitated, as if he didn't want to reveal details that could hurt her. "There are investors interested in the project, people who see opportunities for profit where I see other things." "And what do you see?" "I see a woman who built something beautiful and meaningful, who deserves to have her choices respected." Lydia moved away from him, returning behind the counter in an attempt to put physical distance between them while she processed the information. "So you knew. From the beginning, you knew you could buy my house." "No. I found out yesterday. And the first thing I thought about was how to tell you this. Why should I believe you?" The question came out harsher than she intended, but there was something in the situation that awakened all her defenses. The possibility that August had approached her as part of a business strategy was too devastating to be ignored. "Because if I wanted your property, I would have already made an offer. Because if you were just an obstacle to my plans, I wouldn't be here trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" "From people who won't have the same scruples that I have." Before Lydia could respond, the bell at the door rang and a woman entered. She was elegant in her 40s, with clothes that screamed money and sophistication. Her eyes scanned the tea house environment with an expression that mixed assessment and disdain. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, addressing August directly, "but I need to talk to you." August stood up and there was tension in his posture. "Helen, I didn't expect to see you here." "I imagine not." The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in her expression. "When I heard you were in Stone Peak, I thought it was just business, but apparently there are distractions." Helen's gaze turned to Lydia, and there was something predatory in her assessment. "You must be the owner of this charming house." "I am Lydia Rodriguez." Helen Carter, August's partner in some ventures. The way she said some ventures carried implications that went beyond business. Lydia felt a pang of something she didn't want to recognize as jealousy. "Helen, can we talk outside?" said August, his voice tense. "Of course, darling, but first I'd like to have some tea. This must be a very authentic experience. Helen sat at the table where August had been, clearly marking territory. Lydia, not knowing what else to do, approached to take the order. Black tea, no sugar. And you, August? Will you join me? Actually, I need to go. We have a meeting. Remember? Ah, yes, the meeting. Helen smiled again, and there was something sharp in her expression. About the hotel project. I'm sure it will be very productive. August looked at Lydia with an expression that asked for apologies and understanding at the same time. Lydia, can we talk later? She nodded, although she wasn't sure if she wanted to continue that conversation. Helen's arrival had changed. The entire dynamic, bringing a reality that she wasn't prepared to face. After August left, Helen remained seated, savoring the tea with a thoughtful expression. Interesting place, she finally commented. Very rustic. Thank you, replied Lydia, not knowing if it was a compliment or a criticism. August always had a weakness for charity projects. The observation was made casually, but Lydia perceived the provocation. I don't understand. Oh dear, don't be offended. It's just that he tends to get emotionally involved with the causes he embraces. But in the end, business always comes first. Helen finished the tea and stood up, leaving money on the table. It was a pleasure to meet you, Lydia. I'm sure we'll see each other again very soon. After she left, Lydia was alone with a whirlwind of emotions. The morning had begun with the sweet memory of the kiss in the garden and was now contaminated by doubts and fears that she didn't know how to process. Charity projects. Helen's words echoed in her mind, bringing to the surface all the fears she had tried to ignore. Was it possible that August saw her as a cause, as someone who needed to be protected or helped? The rest of the day passed in a fog of uncertainties. The regular customers came and went, but Lydia felt disconnected from everything, lost in questions about motivations and intentions that she might never be able to completely decipher. It was at the end of the afternoon, when she was closing the house, that she found an envelope that had been slipped under the door. Her name was written in a handwriting she didn't recognize, and the content was a single sheet of paper with a purchase offer for Aurora Tea House. The offered value was 3 times higher than what the property was worth on the market, and the signature at the end was Helen Carter's. Lydia stood in the middle of Aurora Tea House, holding the purchase offer with hands that trembled with anger and disbelief. 3 times the market value. The number danced before her eyes like a promise and a threat at the same time. It was enough money to restart life anywhere, to never worry about financial issues again, to have the freedom she had always dreamed of, but never dared to pursue. But it was also the end of everything she had built in the last 6 years. The paper seemed to burn between her fingers as she reread the formal terms, the legal language that transformed her house, her dreams, her history into a cold and calculated commercial transaction. Helen Carter had not wasted time. She must have prepared the proposal before even arriving in Stone Peak, as if she already knew exactly what her strategy would be. The house phone rang, a shrill sound that made her jump. It was August. Lydia, I need to talk to you. Can I come over now? His voice sounded tense, urgent, and she wondered if he already knew about the offer. I don't know if it's a good idea. Please, there are things I need to explain about Helen, about our history. What kind of history? There was a pause on the other end of the line. The kind I prefer to tell in person. Lydia looked again at the proposal in her hands. All right, but only 15 minutes. Thank you. I'll be there in 5 minutes. She hung up the phone and quickly went up to the apartment, storing the proposal in a drawer as if she could make it disappear along with all the problems it represented. But even out of sight, she could feel the presence of the document, the silent pressure of a decision that would change her life forever. When August arrived, she was waiting at the back door, near the garden where they had kissed the day before. It seemed an eternity since that moment of intimacy, although less than 24 hours had passed. Thank you for receiving me, he said, and there was a vulnerability in his posture that she had never seen before. Say what you need to say. August ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that revealed nervousness. Helen and I had a relationship, serious, 5 years ago. The confession hit her like a punch to the stomach, although part of her already suspected. You were dating? Engaged. For 2 years. What happened? I discovered that she was more interested in my money and the connections I could offer than in me as a person. When I ended the engagement, she didn't take it well. Lydia leaned against the doorframe, processing the information. And now, she came after you. Helen has a real estate investment company. When she heard about the hotel project, she must have seen an opportunity for profit and a chance to, how can I say, reclaim what she considers hers by right. And what does she consider hers by right? August looked her directly in the eyes. Me. The simple answer carried complex implications. Lydia felt a mixture of fear and something she was reluctant to recognize as possessiveness. And you? What do you consider hers by right? Nothing, absolutely nothing. He approached but stopped when he saw that she instinctively retreated. Lydia, you need to believe me. What I feel for you has nothing to do with Helen, with the past. With business, it's something completely new. How can I be sure? Because if it were about business, I would never have changed the hotel project to preserve your privacy. Because if it were about convenience, I would have accepted the proposal that Helen brought this morning. What proposal? To partner. With her on the hotel project. She has contacts, influence, capital. It would be the smartest decision from a business standpoint. Lydia felt something cold settle in her stomach. And why didn't you accept? Because I don't want anything that ties me to her again. Because I've learned that some things are worth more than money. What things? Peace of mind. Honesty. The possibility of sleeping every night knowing that I didn't compromise my values. The words sounded sincere, but Lydia had learned that powerful men were experts at appearing sincere when necessary, and if she continues to insist, then I'll make it very clear that I'm not interested. August? She hesitated, deciding whether she should tell him about the purchase offer. Helen was here earlier after you both left. She was? For what? She left a purchase offer for Aurora Tea House. His expression changed completely, going from concern to anger. She did what? Offered 3 times the market value. August ran his hand over his face, clearly struggling to control his anger. That? She can't do that. Yes, she can. And she did. Lydia, you need to understand, this isn't about your house. It's about hitting me where she knows it will hurt the most. I don't understand. Helen has always been strategic. She realized that you mean something to me, so she's trying to force a situation where I have to choose between my feelings and my business. And what would your choice be? The question hung in the air between them. August approached again, and this time she didn't retreat. You, he said simply. Always you. How can you be sure? Because for the first time in my life, I'm willing to lose money for love. The word love fell between them like a bomb. Neither had used this term before, and now that it had been said, it couldn't be withdrawn. August, I know it's too soon to say this. I know you have every reason not to believe me, but I can't pretend that what I feel is less than it is. Lydia felt her eyes fill with tears. Part of her wanted to run into his arms, believe every word, let herself be carried away by the possibility of a love that seemed too big to be real. Another part warned her about the dangers of trusting a man whose world was so different from hers. I need time to think, she finally said. How much time? I don't know. All of this is very intense, very fast. August nodded, although it was clear he didn't like the answer. I understand. But Lydia, regardless of what you decide about us, don't sell your house to Helen, at least not without consulting a lawyer, without completely understanding your options. Why? Because I have the impression that there's something more behind this offer. Helen never does anything on impulse. If she's offering so much money, it's because she sees an opportunity for even greater profit. After he left, Lydia was alone with her turbulent thoughts. Night fell over Stone Peak, bringing the salt breeze from the sea, but not even the familiar aroma of the ocean managed to calm her agitated mind. She went up to the apartment and took the proposal from the drawer, studying it again with more attention. There were details she hadn't noticed before: the quick response deadline, the clause that required absolute secrecy about the transaction until closing, the severe penalties in case of withdrawal. It was a document prepared by someone who knew exactly what they wanted and how to get it. The next morning, Lydia woke up early, but not with the usual enthusiasm. She went down to prepare the tea house with mechanical movements, as if she were operating on autopilot. Each familiar gesture, lighting the stove, organizing the cups, cutting the cake, seemed laden with melancholy, as if it were a farewell. Mrs. Carman was the first customer, as always, but she brought news that made Lydia's stomach contract. "Lydia, dear, did you hear about the movement at City Hall yesterday?" "What kind of movement?" "A very elegant woman was there talking with the mayor and the urban planning department staff. The meeting lasted hours." Lydia didn't need to ask who the elegant woman was. Helen had wasted no time establishing herself in town, mapping allies, building the necessary structure for her plans. "And you know what else?" continued Mrs. Carman, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "They're saying she made an offer to buy not just the Thompson mansion, but several properties here in the historic downtown." "Several properties?" "Mr. Mitchell's house on the corner, the Wilsons' townhouse, even the old pharmacy. It seems she has big plans for the entire region." The information hit Lydia like lightning. Helen wasn't just interested in her house or in harming August. She was planning something much bigger, something that would completely change the face of Stone Peak's historic downtown. Professor Henry arrived soon after, carrying an envelope that he handed to Lydia with a concerned expression. "This arrived for you at the library," he said. "An elegant woman asked me to deliver it personally." Inside the envelope was Helen's business card and a handwritten note. "I hope you've had time to consider my proposal. I'd like to talk today, if possible. There are details that might interest you." "Hi, CEO Professor," said Lydia, deciding she needed advice. "May I ask you a question?" "Of course, dear." "If someone offered you 3 times the value of your house, would you sell?" Professor Henry studied her with those wise eyes that had seen many seasons of human life. "It depends. On what? On what you would be buying with that money. If it were freedom, perhaps yes. If it were just a prettier house somewhere else, probably not." "And if it were? Security?" "Ah, security." He smiled sadly. "My dear Lydia, I've learned that true security doesn't come from a bank account. It comes from knowing who we are and what we are capable of. And if we don't know, then perhaps it's time to find out." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Helen Carter, who entered the tea house as if she were its owner. She was even more elegant than the day before, wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than Lydia earned in 6 months. "Good morning, Lydia. I hope you received my note." "I did." "Great. Can we talk in private?" Professor Henry discreetly stood up. "I'll take a walk in the plaza garden. See you later, Lydia." After he left, Helen settled at the table near the window, the same one that August always chose. The symbolism didn't go unnoticed by Lydia. "I hope you've had time to consider my proposal," said Helen, going straight to the point. "I'm still thinking." "I understand. It's an important decision." Helen smiled, but there was something sharp in her expression. "Perhaps I can facilitate your decision by sharing some information." "What kind of information?" "About August, about his business methods, about why he really came back to Stone Peak." Lydia felt a chill down her spine. "I'm listening." "August didn't tell you that he's having serious financial problems, did he? That his company is on the verge of bankruptcy?" "That's not true." "No?" Helen took a folder from her purse and placed some documents on the table. "These are public financial reports of his company. Huge debts, labor lawsuits, investments that went wrong." Lydia looked at the documents without touching them, as if they were poisonous. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I want you to understand that the hotel project isn't about nostalgia or reconnecting with roots. It's about necessity. August needs this venture to succeed, to save his company. So what? So your house is in the way. If you don't sell, he'll find other ways to get your property. What other ways? Helen leaned over the table, lowering her voice. Do you know the history of the Thompson family, the former owners of the mansion? A little. They were forced to sell to August's grandfather in the 60s. There was a mysterious fire in their property downtown, problems with documentation, sudden financial pressures. What are you insinuating? That the Bennett family has a history of getting what they want regardless of the methods. Lydia felt a growing nausea. August wouldn't do something like that. Are you sure? Is the August you know the same one, who built a business empire stepping on anyone who got in the way? I don't believe you. Helen sighed as if she were dealing with a stubborn child. Lydia, you seem like an intelligent woman. Don't let yourself be deceived by romance and beautiful words. Men like August are experts at getting what they want through emotional manipulation. Like you did with him? The question caught Helen off guard. For a moment, her mask of sophistication slipped, revealing something more vulnerable underneath. August told you about our relationship. He said you were engaged. We were much more than that. We were partners, confidants, a perfect team. Until he decided I was no longer convenient. There was real bitterness in Helen's voice, a pain that explained much about her motivations. He left you. He discarded me when he decided he needed to clean up his public image. Apparently, our business methods were too problematic for his new phase. What methods? Helen didn't respond directly. The important thing is that I know who August really is, and you don't. Then why don't you tell me? Because I prefer to let him reveal himself. But when that happens, my offer will still be valid. Helen stood up, leaving the financial documents on the table. Think carefully, Lydia. 3 times the market value for a property that may be worth much less when August finishes doing what he needs to do. After she left, Lydia was alone with the documents and her doubts. The numbers on the pages seemed to confirm what Helen had said. August's company was indeed facing serious financial difficulties. But there was something in the way Helen had presented the information that didn't seem completely honest, as if she were telling only part of the truth, the part that served her purposes. The bell at the door rang again, and August entered, stopping abruptly when he saw the documents spread on the table. Helen was here, he said, and it wasn't a question. She was, and showed these reports. She did. August approached the table and collected the documents with tired movements. It's true, the company is having problems. The confession surprised her. She had expected denials, explanations, excuses. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't want you to think that my feelings for you had any relation to financial needs. And do they? No. He looked her directly in the eyes. The hotel project can help me financially, that's true, but I don't need your property for it to succeed. Helen said you do. Helen is lying, or at least telling only part of the truth. What part? August sighed, running his hand through his hair in a gesture that she was beginning to recognize as a sign of extreme nervousness. The company has debts, that's true, but not because of bad management or wrong investments. Then why? Because of Helen. When I ended our relationship, she had access to privileged information about my business. She used that information to sabotage important contracts, spread rumors about my integrity, create problems where none existed. Why would she do something like that? Revenge. Helen doesn't accept losing, and she considers me a personal loss. Lydia processed the information, trying to decide whom to believe. And if she's telling the truth about your family's methods. My grandfather was a man of his time. He did things that today I consider morally questionable. But I am not my grandfather. How can I be sure? Because if I were like him, I would have already found a way to get your property without asking your permission. The answer had logic, but Lydia continued to feel as if she were navigating in a storm without being able to see the horizon. August, I need time, I need space to think. How much time? I don't know, maybe it's better if you don't come here for a few days until I can organize my thoughts. She could see that the suggestion hurt him, but he nodded. If that's what you need. It is. But Lydia, please don't make any definitive decision about Helen's offer without talking to me first. Why? Because I have the impression that she hasn't told everything about her plans for this region. After he left, Lydia sat in the chair he had occupied so many times, trying to separate her feelings from the conflicting information she had received. There was genuine love in August's eyes when he looked at her, she was sure of that. But there was also a determination that frightened her, a willpower that could be both protection and threat. The afternoon passed slowly, with few customers and many hours to think. When she finally closed the tea house, Lydia had more doubts than certainties, more questions than answers. It was then that she saw lights going on, not only in the Thompson mansion, but also in Mr. Mitchell's house on the corner, and in the Wilsons' townhouse, and in the old pharmacy. Helen hadn't lied about one thing. She really did have big plans for the entire region, and for the first time, Lydia wondered if her small Aurora tea house wasn't just an obstacle in Helen's way, but the central piece of a much bigger and more dangerous game than she had imagined. 3 days passed without August appearing at Aurora Tea House. 3 days that seemed like 3 months to Lydia, who found herself listening attentively to every sound from the street, every movement near the window, every ring of the doorbell, in the hope that it would be him. His absence created a void that she hadn't expected to feel so intensely, as if an essential part of her routine had been torn away. But they were 3 days that brought her clarity about many things. On Wednesday morning, Professor Henry arrived, earlier than usual, carrying a thick envelope and a worried expression that immediately caught Lydia's attention. "Dear, I need to show you something I found in the library archives," he said, without even asking for his usual tea. "What is it?" "Documents about the history of our region, things that perhaps I should have looked for before, when rumors began to circulate about big changes in the historic downtown." Professor Henry opened the envelope and spread on the table a series of old documents. City plans from the 60s, property records, newspaper clippings yellowed by time. Remember the story Helen told about the Thompson family? About how they were forced to sell to August's grandfather? I remember. Well, the story isn't quite like that. He pointed to one of the newspaper clippings. I found the original report about the sale. There was no coercion, no mysterious fire. Mr. Edward Thompson sold the property because he needed the money to pay for his wife's medical treatment, who had cancer. Lydia took the clipping and read the article. Indeed, there was nothing sinister about the transaction. August's grandfather had even helped the family find a smaller but comfortable house in another neighborhood where they could live with dignity. So, Helen lied about that? She lied, but there's more. Professor Henry pointed to another document. These are property records from the 80s. They show that August's grandfather, after buying the mansion, invested a lot of money in preserving not only his property, but the entire historic downtown. He was one of the founders of the association that achieved the heritage protection of the region. The information completely changed the narrative that Helen had constructed. Why would she invent a story like that? Because she needs a moral justification for her plans. If she can convince people that the Bennett family has a history of questionable practices, it becomes easier to justify her own actions. What actions? Professor Henry took a sheet of paper. From the envelope, a copy of an official document. I got a friend at City Hall to show me Helen Carter's true plans. She doesn't just want to buy isolated properties. She wants to transform the entire historic downtown into a kind of luxury tourist complex. Lydia studied the document. It was an ambitious and disturbing project, where today there were family homes, small businesses, and the simple life of a small town. Helen planned to build an exclusive resort, with hotels, expensive restaurants, designer shops, and even a golf course where the main square is now. Is this legal? Technically, yes. If she manages to buy all the properties voluntarily, she can do whatever she wants with them. And if some people don't want to sell? Professor Henry looked at her with a somber expression. That's when the problems begin. Economic pressures, bureaucratic problems, difficulties of all kinds for those who insist on staying. Lydia felt a chill down her spine. "Professor, may I ask why you're showing me this?" "Because your tea house isn't just a property she wants to buy. It's the central piece of the entire project. Look here." He pointed to the map attached to the project. "Your house would be exactly where she plans to build the main lobby of the resort. If you don't sell, the entire project is compromised." "So, that's why she's offering so much money." "Exactly, and that's why if you don't accept, she'll probably try other strategies." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Carman, who entered with an expression of urgency that was unusual for her normally calm personality. "Lydia, dear, you need to know what's happening," she said, without even sitting down. "Last night, there was a meeting at the town council. That woman, Helen, presented a grand project to transform our town into a luxury tourist destination. We found out about that yesterday," said Professor Henry. "Ah, but you don't know everything. She also said she has a letter of intent signed by you, Lydia, confirming your interest in selling the tea house." Lydia stood up abruptly. "That's a lie. I never signed anything." "I know, dear. But she showed a document to the council members, with your signature. Forged? Probably. But the document exists, and she's using it to pressure the council to approve changes to the building code that would facilitate her project." The situation was becoming complicated in ways Lydia had never imagined. Helen wasn't just trying to buy her property. She was creating an alternative reality where the sale had already happened. "What can I do?" "First, you need a lawyer," said Professor Henry. "Second, you need to talk to August. He knows Helen better than any of us." The mention of August's name brought back all the emotions that Lydia had tried to organize in the last few days. Longing, confusion, fear, but also an urgent need to see him, to understand his version of the facts. "I don't know if I should seek him out." "Dear," said Mrs. Carman, finally sitting down, "sometimes pride is a luxury we can't afford, especially when we're in danger." "Danger? Do you think a woman capable of forging documents will stop there?" Mrs. Carman's question echoed in Lydia's mind for the rest of the morning. After her customers left, she remained alone in the tea house, looking at the Thompson mansion where the lights remained on, where August was probably working, unaware of what was happening around him. It was then that she decided to break the silence. She crossed the street for the first time since he had arrived in Stone Peak. The abandoned garden seemed less wild now, with some trails opened and construction equipment organized near the gate. She knocked on the main door, a sound that echoed through the interior of the house like a cry for help. August opened the door, and the surprise on his face was immediately followed by concern. "Lydia, did something happen?" "I need to talk to you." "Of course. Come in." The interior of the mansion was even more impressive than she had imagined. Even with the deterioration from years of abandonment, it was possible to see the original grandeur: high ceilings with ornate moldings, cracked but still beautiful marble floors, wooden staircases that curved elegantly up to the upper floors. "You're working late," she observed, seeing papers spread on an improvised table in what had once been the main room. "Trying to solve some problems with the project, but that can wait." He guided her to two chairs near one of the windows, where the afternoon light created colored patterns through the old glass. "What happened?" Lydia told him everything. Professor Henry's research, the discovery about Helen's true plans, the forged letter of intent, the maneuvers at the town council. August listened in silence, his expression becoming darker with each revelation. "I knew she was capable of many things, but I didn't imagine she would go this far," he said when she finished. "So you believe me?" "Of course I believe you. Helen has always been creative when it came to getting what she wanted." "What can I do?" August stood up and began to walk around the room, clearly thinking of strategies. "First, we'll document everything. I need to see this forged letter, understand how she got a signature that looks like yours. And then we'll expose her true plans to the town. If people knew that she intends to destroy the historic downtown to build a luxury resort, the resistance would be much greater. Do you think that would work? I've known Helen for a long time. She bets on people's ignorance and greed. When the cards are on the table, she usually backs down. Lydia felt relieved to have someone with experience by her side, but also guilty for having doubted August. "I'm sorry for believing the things she said about you." "Don't apologize. She's very convincing. That's why it took me so long to realize who she really was." "What was your relationship like?" The question came out before she could think better. August stopped walking and looked at her with an expression that mixed surprise and something that seemed like relief. "Do you really want to know?" "I do." He sat down again, but this time closer to her. "I met Helen at a business event in Miami. She was intelligent, ambitious, beautiful. She seemed like the perfect partner for a man who thought success was everything in life." "What changed?" "I began to realize that she saw people as pieces in a chess game. Employees, clients, even me. We were all useful as long as we served her purposes." "And when did you realize that?" "When she suggested that we fire 50 employees before Christmas to improve the annual balance sheet numbers, not out of financial necessity but to impress investors." Lydia could imagine the coldness necessary for such a suggestion. "And you ended the relationship?" "I tried. But Helen doesn't accept no as an answer. She started a sabotage campaign that lasted months. Important clients cancelled contracts. Suppliers created problems. Even close friends began to distance themselves. That's why your company is having financial difficulties." "Exactly. But that's also why I decided to come here. I wanted to start over in a place where I could remember who I was before I got lost in the business world. And are you succeeding?" August looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "I was, until you asked me to stay away. I'm sorry, I was confused, afraid. And now?" The question hung in the air between them. Lydia knew that her answer would change everything, that there would be no going back once the words were spoken. "Now, I know I want to fight for this," she said, pointing to the space between them. "For us?" August smiled, that smile that she had missed so much in the last few days. "Then let's fight together." He leaned in to kiss her, and this time she didn't hesitate. The kiss was different from the first one, in the tea house garden. There was urgency, need, but also a promise of future. When they separated, both were breathing heavily. "August," she whispered against his lips. There's something I need to tell you about myself, about why I came to Stone Peak." He moved back slightly to look her in the eyes. "You can tell me anything." Lydia took a deep breath, preparing to share something she had never told anyone in town. "I was married in Jacksonville." The revelation didn't seem to shock him as much as she expected. "And what happened?" "My husband, he was controlling, possessive. At first I thought it was love that he cared about me, but gradually he isolated me from friends, from family, making me feel incapable of living without him." "Did he hurt you?" "Not physically, but there was constant emotional violence. He convinced me that I was ugly, worthless, that no one else would want me, that I should be grateful he accepted me." August took her hands in his, a gesture that conveyed strength and protection. "How did you manage to leave?" "Aunt Hope. She showed up one day, said she missed me, that she wanted me to come spend a vacation in Stone Peak. My husband didn't want to let me go, but she insisted so much that he eventually gave in, thinking I would return in a few days." "And you didn't return?" "No. For the first time in years I could breathe. I remembered who I was before I got lost in that relationship. When he demanded that I return, I said no." "Did he try to force you?" "He tried. He showed up here a few times, made threats, tried to convince me that I couldn't survive alone. But Aunt Hope gave me the strength to resist. That's why you're so afraid of getting involved again." "Yes. I learned that powerful men can be dangerous when they don't get what they want." August squeezed her hands more tightly. "Lydia, I promise I will never be like him, that I will always respect your choices, even when I don't agree with them." "How can I be sure?" "Because I'm willing to prove it every day for the rest of my life, if you let me." The declaration moved her deeply, but also brought back the reality of the problems they faced. And if Helen manages to separate us, she won't succeed, but we need to be smart. She's dangerous when she feels threatened. What do you suggest? That we spend a few days planning our strategy, gathering evidence, talking to the right people, preparing to confront her. Together. Together. Lydia felt stronger than she had felt in a very long time. Having August by her side, knowing she wasn't alone in this fight, changed everything. August? Yes? I love you too. The words came out naturally, without fear, without hesitation. August kissed her again, more intensely this time, as if he was sealing a pact that went beyond romance. Then let's save your tea house, he said against her lips. And then let's build a life together. Promise, I promise. But even as they made plans and declarations of love, neither of them noticed the figure watching them through the side window of the mansion. Helen Carter was outside, hidden by the shadows of the garden, hearing every word, every promise, every strategy they discussed. And the cold smile on her face suggested she had her own plans to deal with that inconvenient declaration of war. The next morning, Lydia woke with a sense of optimism she hadn't felt in a long time. Having shared her story with August, having heard his own words of love, having made concrete plans to face Helen together, all this made her feel as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She went down to the tea house with lighter movements, humming a song she hadn't heard in years. She was preparing the first batch of tea when she heard urgent knocking at the door. It was too early for any customer, but when she opened it, she found Mrs. Carman with an expression of panic. Lydia, dear, you need to know what happened during the night. What was it? There was a fire at Mr. Mitchell's house, small but enough to cause significant damage, and at the pharmacy too, and at the Wilsons' townhouse. Lydia's blood froze. What do you mean? 3 fires on the same night, all at properties that Helen was interested in buying. The police say it could be a coincidence, but you don't believe that. Do you? Lydia thought about Helen's veiled threats, the conversation she and August had had the night before, the possibility that someone had heard them. No, I don't believe in coincidences. There's more. Mr. Mitchell, desperate about the damage, accepted Helen's offer this morning. The Wilsons too. You're the only one who hasn't decided yet. The message was clear. Accept the offer or face the consequences. Helen was escalating the pressure, using methods that made it clear how far she was willing to go. Mrs. Carman, I need a favor. Anything, dear. Can you take care of the tea house for a few hours? I need to talk to August. Of course, but Lydia, be careful, that woman is dangerous. Lydia ran across the street, knocking on the mansion door with urgency. When August opened, she threw herself into his arms, trembling with fear and anger. She burned the houses, she said without preamble. Helen had the properties she wanted to buy burned. August held her tightly, his expression changing from concern to determination. So the war has begun. What do we do now? Now we show her that we're not the only ones with cards to play. What cards? August smiled, but there was something dangerous in his expression. I've known Helen for a long time. I know where all her secrets are buried. And for the first time since this whole story had begun, Lydia felt that perhaps they had a real chance of winning. The next 2 days were a succession of silent and strategic preparations that reminded Lydia of the suspense movies she used to watch, but with the terrifying difference that this time her real life was at stake. August had transformed into a version of himself that she didn't know, calculating, determined, with a coldness that both impressed and worried her. He had spent the last 48 hours on the phone with contacts in Jacksonville, Miami, and Washington, gathering information about Helen that she had managed to keep hidden for years. Meanwhile, Lydia kept the tea house running normally, serving teas and pretending a normality that she was far from feeling, especially when she saw the neighboring properties with the marks of the fires, constant reminders of what Helen was capable of doing. On Friday morning, August arrived at Aurora Tea House with a thick folder and an expression that mixed triumph and something that almost seemed like pity. "I got it," he said, placing the folder on the counter. "Everything we—" "Need to stop, Helen." Lydia looked at the folder as if it were a loaded weapon. "What's in there?" Evidence of tax fraud, false documents, bribes to public officials, threats to competitors, 15 years of criminal practices that she thought would never come to light. Audisa, did you get all this? Helen made a fatal mistake. She betrayed people who had access to the same information she used against me. When these people learned that she was trying to destroy me again, they decided to collaborate. Lydia opened the folder and quickly leafed through the documents. They were copies of fraudulent contracts, recordings of compromising conversations, bank records showing suspicious transfers, enough material to completely ruin Helen's reputation and probably put her in prison. Is this real? Unfortunately, yes. Helen was always ambitious, but in recent years she crossed all ethical and legal lines. And now? Now we're going to offer her the same choice she offered you: accept our terms or face the consequences. Lydia felt uncomfortable with the idea of blackmail, even if it was in self-defense. I don't like the idea of using her methods against her. I don't either. But sometimes we need to speak the language that people understand. And if she doesn't accept, then we turn everything over to the FBI and the IRS. The contacts who helped me gather this material are already prepared for that. The conversation was interrupted by the entrance of Professor Henry, who brought fresh news from City Hall. Lydia, August, you need to know what's happening at the town council. Helen has called an extraordinary session for this afternoon. She's going to present an ultimatum. Either the town approves her project completely, or she withdraws all investments and leaves. What kind of pressure is she applying? Asked August. She's promising jobs, economic growth, putting our town on the map of international tourism, and she's suggesting that any resistance comes from people who don't want progress. Lydia felt a wave of anger. She's manipulating the entire town. Exactly, and it's working. Most of the council members are inclined to approve the project. August closed the folder with a decisive movement. Then today is when we end this. What are you going to do? Asked Professor Henry. I'm going to that meeting and I'm going to show Helen and the entire town who she really is. Lydia felt her heart accelerate. August, it's dangerous. If she's really capable of having houses set on fire, that's why I'm not going alone. Lydia, I need you to come with me. Me? You're the owner of Aurora Tea House. Your voice is important in this discussion. And he hesitated. I need you by my side. The vulnerability in those last words touched Lydia deeply. After years of avoiding confrontations, hiding behind silences and strategic retreats, the idea of confronting Helen publicly terrified her. But at the same time, there was something liberating in the possibility of finally openly fighting for something that mattered. All right. I'll go with you. Professor Henry smiled. The two of you together make a formidable team. Helen doesn't know what's waiting for her. The afternoon arrived with a fine rain that transformed the streets of Stone Peak into a liquid mirror. Lydia had closed the tea house early and dressed with more care than she usually did. A simple but elegant white blouse, a dark skirt that made her look more confident, her hair loose for the first time in months. When August saw her, his look lit up in a way that made her feel beautiful, desired, powerful. You look beautiful, he said, taking her hand. I'm nervous. So am I. But we'll face this together. The town hall was as crowded as Lydia had never seen. It seemed that the entire population of Stone Peak had come to hear Helen's presentation. The air was charged with expectation and tension, conversations in low voices that stopped abruptly when Helen entered the room. She was radiant, wearing a red-tailored suit that made her look like a successful executive, hair impeccably arranged, a confident smile that suggested anticipated victory. She greeted the council members as if they were old friends, distributed elaborate documents, set up a PowerPoint presentation that promised to transform Stone Peak into a jewel of Florida, tourism, Lydia and August sat in the last rows, observing as Helen methodically built her case. She spoke passionately about economic development, about job opportunities, about putting Stone Peak on the world map of luxury tourism. She showed beautiful renderings of the resort she planned to build, impressive fiscal revenue numbers, growth, projections that made the council members' eyes shine. "As you can see," said Helen, pointing to one of the images on the screen, "this project isn't just about building a resort. It's about giving Stone Peak the future it deserves." Many people in the audience nodded, clearly impressed. Helen was a skilled presenter, knew exactly which buttons to press to awaken dreams of prosperity in a town that had always struggled with economic limitations. "Of course," she continued, "there's still a small issue to be resolved. A property at the heart of the project that hasn't yet been acquired. But I'm sure that the owner, when she understands the importance of what we're proposing for the entire community, will make the right decision." All eyes turned to Lydia, who felt her face heat up. Helen had deliberately created a situation where she seemed to be the only obstacle between the town and prosperity. It was then that August stood up. "I'd like to ask some questions," he said, his voice carrying easily throughout the room. Helen saw him for the first time since she had entered the hall, and for a moment her mask of confidence slipped. "August, what a surprise to see you here. I imagine so. May I ask some questions about your project?" The council president, a middle-aged man, clearly impressed with Helen's presentation, nodded affirmatively. "Please, Mr. Bennett." "August." "Bennett, I'm the owner of the Thompson Mansion and have a direct interest in this discussion." Helen quickly regained her composure. "Of course, August. What questions do you have?" August walked to the front of the room, carrying the folder he had brought from the tea house. "First question. You mentioned that you have a letter of intent signed by the owner of Aurora Tea House, confirming her interest in selling the property. Could you show that letter?" "Certainly." Helen opened her own folder and withdrew a document. "Here it is." August examined the paper for a few seconds, then turned to the audience. "This is a forgery. The signature was forged." A murmur of surprise ran through the hall. Helen maintained her smile, but there was a rigidity in her posture. "That's a very serious accusation, August. I hope you have proof." "I do." August opened his folder and withdrew several documents. "I have here an official graphological analysis of the signature, comparing it with authentic documents signed by the tea house owner. The difference is clear." He passed the documents to the council president, who examined them with growing concern. "Additionally," continued August, "I have records here showing that you've used similar methods in other projects." "What methods?" asked one of the council members. "Falsification of documents, bribery of public officials, intimidation of owners who refused to sell their properties." Helen stood up abruptly. "Those are unfounded accusations. August is obviously resentful because our personal relationship ended badly." "Personal relationship?" August smiled coldly. "It's interesting that you mention that, because I have here recordings of conversations where you discuss methods to force owners to sell their houses, including—" He made a dramatic pause. "Threats of suspicious fires." The silence in the hall was absolute. Helen had visibly paled. This is completely true?" August placed a small recorder on the table and pressed play. Helen's voice came out clear and unequivocal. "If they don't want to sell willingly, there will be accidents. Fires happen, especially in old buildings, and after the accidents, they'll be so desperate that they'll accept any offer." The impact was devastating. People in the audience stood up, council members exchanged shocked looks, and Helen stood in the middle of the room like an actress who had completely forgotten her lines. "That recording is fake," she shouted, but her voice came out high-pitched, desperate. "I can provide the technical report that proves its authenticity," said August calmly, "just as I can provide evidence that you've already used these methods in other projects, including the fires that happened here in Stone Peak in the last few days." It was then that Lydia stood up. Her legs were trembling, but her voice came out firm and clear. "I didn't sign any letter of intent. I never expressed interest in selling my property. and I won't be intimidated by threats or blackmail." The audience exploded in murmurs of support. Lydia could see familiar faces: Mrs. Carman, Professor Henry, even Mr. Mitchell, who had lost part of his house in the fire, all looking at her with a mixture of admiration and encouragement. "Furthermore," continued Lydia, feeling a strength she didn't know she possessed, "I want everyone to know that the project presented here today would completely destroy the historic downtown of our town. There would be no more family homes, small businesses, the simple life that makes Stone Peak a special place. There would only be a luxury resort that most of us couldn't even afford to visit." Helen tried to regain control of the situation. "You're being manipulated by a man who is clearly obsessed with me and by a woman who can't see beyond her own selfish interests." But her credibility had been completely destroyed. The council president stood up with a severe expression. "Ms. Carter, in view of the evidence presented here today, this council cannot proceed with the vote on your project. Furthermore, we feel obligated to forward this information to the appropriate authorities." Helen looked around the room, seeing faces that had changed from admiration to distrust and revulsion. For a moment, she seemed like an ordinary woman, vulnerable, defeated. But then her expression hardened again. "You'll regret this," she said, looking directly at Lydia and August. "You think you've won, but this is far from over." She quickly gathered her documents and left the hall under hostile looks. Lydia felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had won the battle, but Helen didn't seem the type of person who would easily accept defeat. August approached her, taking her hand. "You were amazing," he said, low enough that only she could hear. "I was terrified. You couldn't tell. You seemed like a warrior." People began to approach them, congratulating them, thanking them for exposing the truth about Helen. Professor Henry arrived with tears in his eyes. "You saved our town," he said. "We saved it together," replied Lydia, "all of us." They left the town hall under a rain that had stopped, leaving the air clean and fragrant. They walked hand in hand through the streets of Stone Peak, passing by the houses that Helen had tried to buy, by the historic downtown they had helped preserve, by the simple but authentic life they had defended. "What happens now?" asked Lydia. When they reached Aurora Tea House. "Now we rebuild. I finish my hotel project, completely respecting the historic environment. You continue with your tea house. And we... August stopped in front of the tea house door, turning to look at her in the soft light of the late afternoon. "And we build a life together if you want to." "I want to," she said without hesitation. "But what about your financial problems?" "They're already being solved. Some of the investors that Helen had driven away have returned seeking partnerships when they learned the truth. And there's a company in Miami interested in buying some of the technologies I developed. So you'll stay, definitely." "Lydia, I didn't come back to Stone Peak to build a hotel. I came back because I was looking for a home, and I found that with you." She leaned in to kiss him, and this time there was no urgency, no fear of interruption, no shadows of doubt between them. It was a kiss that sealed not just a romance, but a partnership, a promise of a future built on honesty and courage. When they separated, Lydia noticed that there was a familiar figure waiting across the street. Helen was standing near the Thompson mansion, observing them with an expression that she couldn't decipher. "She's still here," said Lydia. August followed her gaze and sighed. "I'll talk to her." "No, let's go together." They crossed the street hand in hand. Helen waited for them without moving, and when they approached, Lydia could see that she had been crying. "I came to say goodbye," said Helen, her voice stripped of the arrogance that had always characterized it. "And to apologize?" asked August. "I don't know if apologies are enough for what I did." Helen looked at Lydia. "Especially to you. I didn't know you, but I tried to destroy your life because it represented something I wanted and couldn't have." "Why?" asked Lydia. "Why did you go so far?" Helen remained silent for a long moment. "Because when you lose someone you love to someone you consider inferior, it shatters something inside you, and instead of dealing with that pain, I decided that the fault was everyone's but mine." "Helen," said August, You didn't lose me to... Lydia, you lost me to your own choices. I know I always knew, but it was easier to blame others than to admit that I had become someone that even I could no longer recognize. Lydia felt a pang of pity for the woman who had tried to destroy her life. What will you do now? I'll leave, far away. Maybe try to discover who I was before I got lost in ambition and the need to control everything around me. The authorities will look for you, said August. I know. I'll turn myself in before they find me. It's the least I can do. Helen approached Lydia, extending her hand. I'm sorry for everything. You're stronger than I ever was. Lydia shook her hand, surprised, to feel compassion instead of anger. I hope you find what you're looking for. Thank you. Helen turned to August. Take good care of her and of yourself. You both deserve to be happy. She walked away slowly, a solitary figure who disappeared into the mist of the approaching night. Lydia and August remained watching until she was out of sight. Do you feel sorry for her? Asked August. A little. It's sad to see someone so lost in their own ambitions. You're more generous than I would be. It's not generosity, it's relief. Seeing Helen broken made me realize that I too could have become bitter if I hadn't found a purpose here in Stone Peak. August hugged her, protecting her from the cold wind that was beginning to blow from the sea. And now, what purpose will we find together? Lydia looked at Aurora Tea House, illuminated and welcoming on the quiet street, then at the Thompson mansion, where August had found his way back home, and finally at the man who held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Let's build something beautiful, she said. Something that honors the history of this place and at the same time creates possibilities for the future. Like what? How about a small and charming inn in the mansion where people can come seeking tranquility and authenticity, and a tea house that serves not only drinks but also stories, encounters, moments of genuine connection? August smiled. And maybe a common garden between the two properties where we can plant not only herbs for tea, but also flowers for guests to take as souvenirs? And perhaps, said Lydia, feeling a boldness she didn't know existed in herself, a small house in the back where we can live together and wake up every morning seeing the sun rise over the sea. Are you asking me to live with you? I'm asking us to build a life together, for real. Then my answer is yes to everything. They kissed again, there on the street where everything had begun, surrounded by the familiar smells of sea air and wildflowers, by the comforting sounds of a small town preparing to sleep, by the sensation that they had found not only each other, but also versions of themselves they didn't know existed. 6. Months later, Aurora Inn and Aurora Tea House operated as an integrated complex that attracted visitors from all over the United States. Not the mass tourism that Helen had planned, but a steady flow of people seeking authenticity, connection with nature, real stories told by real people. Lydia had transformed into not just a successful businesswoman, but a recognized storyteller. She welcomed guests with special teas and narratives about Stone Peak's history, about local legends, about the magic of living in a town where time seemed to pass more slowly. August had discovered that business success could come together with social purpose. The inn employed local residents, bought products from regional suppliers, invested a percentage of its profits in historical and environmental preservation projects. But the greatest transformation had happened between them. Lydia had learned that love didn't need to be a surrender, that she could maintain her independence and at the same time share her life with someone. August had discovered that true power didn't come from controlling situations or people, but from building together with someone you love. On a spring morning, while they prepared breakfast together for the inn's guests, August stopped what he was doing and looked at Lydia with that expression she had learned to recognize: love, admiration, and a deep gratitude for having found each other. You know what impresses me most about you, he said. What? The way you transformed your fear into courage, your fragility into strength, your silence into stories that touch people's hearts. I learned from you that sometimes we need to face our fears to discover who we really are. And what did you discover? Lydia stopped cutting fruit and turned to him, smiling with a confidence she never imagined she would possess. I discovered that I'm much stronger than I thought, that I can love without losing myself, that I can be vulnerable without being weak, and that I can build something beautiful and meaningful when I have the right person by my side. And am I the right person? You're the perfect person. They kissed there in the inn's kitchen, surrounded by the smells of fresh bread and brewing coffee, by the sounds of Stone Peak waking up to another day of possibilities, by the certainty that they had found not only love, but also the place where they belonged. Outside, the sun was rising over the sea, painting the sky with colors that changed every second. It was a new day in the life they had built together, a life where silence had given way to words of love, where fear had been replaced by courage, where two wounded people had found healing in each other. And at Aurora Tea House, which continued to be the heart of everything, a new cup waited on the counter, ready to receive the next visitor who arrived seeking not just a tea, but a story, a connection, a moment of magic in a small town where love had overcome all obstacles. The life that Lydia and August had built wasn't perfect, but it was true, and in that golden dawn, that was more than enough. It was everything.